glad to see you again. Those of you who joined us on Wednesday and got a little bit of a tour of Middle Tennessee. So we're going to look kind of a flyover view of some of the furniture and other things that we have here in Middle Tennessee, and hope to look to some of the inspirations that brought these earliest people to our part of the world. So we'll have a chance to look a little bit at Baltimore. We'll see a little bit of Philadelphia, perhaps a passing glance at New York, coastal and Piedmont, North Carolina, and even such an exotic place as Connecticut might factor into what we look at a little bit here today. But before we start, I want to make a public service announcement by way of our cousin Minnie Pearl here, who would like to tell you that that hot chicken that you had last night at the reception is really not Nashville hot chicken. Hot chicken you should be aware of and take the necessary precautions if you're going to partake. We furnished 3 presidents and came within a hair's glance of our 4th, which would have totally upset my whole rhythm of these things that you're going to see here, but we're familiar with these guys from the 19th century. We're notable across the state in West Tennessee for the barbecue of our process of trying to make spring water much more palatable here in the mid-state. And then, of course, moon pies, which is the only appropriate dessert that you should ever consider with an RC Cola. You may also be aware of our participation in the creation of the Delta Blues, of what in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, these young people from Fisk University going to Europe to raise funds for Jubilee Hall, and of course in Upper East Tennessee, the very birthplace of country music. You may be familiar with some of our entertainers, Miss Turner, who passed away last year, Miss Cannon, who was a Nashvilleian by birth, and Miss Fox here, who is one of the new faces on the screen. You may know some of our other folks here, Mr. Timberlake, Miss Witherspoon, and Mr. Tarantino, who was just in Knoxville for a minute. But you're looking here west, middle, east. All of these are either Tennesseans by birth or those that we have adopted and who've made Tennessee their home. We are the ground zero for the original First Name Club. Before Beyonce and Cher and Swifties, we've got Elvis, Johnny, and Dolly. And some really masterful folks that contributed to the early 20th century and went beyond what we consider to be the normal ideas behind photography, sculpture, and painting. All of these, again, west, middle, east, as you look across the screen there. We have our own myth makers here in the state of Tennessee. Mr. David Crockett, Davy, as you probably know him, who himself was a great promoter of himself during the early 19th century, publishing these little almanacs. Go Ahead was the thing that you saw in these serial descriptions of fighting bars and things such as that. And you know he killed a bar when he was only 3, because you've seen Mr. Parker here, who played both Crockett and Daniel Boone in the 50s and 60s. And in truth, in Hollywood's version of Tennessee, Mr. Boone, who wound up being famous in Kentucky, and Mr. Crockett, who winds up being famous in Tennessee and Texas, appear to be homogenized into the same person. And in truth, if you go back and look at the Crockett stories versus the Boone stories, they pretty much look the same there. But that's the real man there in the center as he presented himself, a congressman who, in this theme of west, middle, and east, as we read across here, actually is born in East Tennessee, moves to Middle Tennessee, and eventually West Tennessee before he announces that he's going on to Texas and finds his fate in 1836 at the Alamo. So we do take these divisions somewhat seriously, and here you see a true divided part of the state where we see east and the middle, which is the largest geographic context. Middle is separated from the west by the Tennessee River. That's the separation line. Between middle and east, it is the Cumberland Plateau. And then in East Tennessee, you have mountains in the extreme east, you have the Tennessee River Valley, and then you rise up the plateau, and then you cross into Middle Tennessee, you come down off the plateau, the Highland Rim, and into the Nashville Basin, which is where we are today. So the furniture that I'm going to discuss with you largely today can be seen mostly in this Cumberland River watershed in the Stones River watershed in this area. This is Davidson, where we are, Wilson, where I'm from, Rutherford, Williamson, Sumner, where we went the other day. Those are the counties that we're sort of looking towards. So we didn't just get to where we were from an empty vacuum. Middle Tennessee has been the site of civilization for well over 1,000 years, just not continuously. You see here a Mississippian mound village in my county east of here at Sellers Mound, and one of the principal artifacts that has come forth from that now in the collection of the McClung Museum in Knoxville. Sandy, as he is nicknamed, part of the Mississippian culture. I pointed out to you the other day, for those who were with us on the tour, the mound site at Cheskiki across from Wynwood, the log house. So this would have been similar to what you would have seen at that site if you were here 1,000 or so years ago. But this culture disappeared. We don't know why, but about 100 or so years before the Spanish make an arc across Tennessee with DeSoto, they're gone. And the historic tribes that the first Anglo-British meet here in the time of settlement and conflict they just call these the old ones. They've seen these artifacts as well. And these artifacts are exciting to those who first come here and things that they actually plow up. So they see evidence of this earlier culture, and they're kind of mystified about what they're seeing. In fact, this is an artifact that was found by plowing in the 1790s along the Cumberland River in southern Kentucky. The Cumberland River comes out of south central Kentucky and flows down into Tennessee and then back through Kentucky before it gets to Ohio. And this particular artifact made its way to Monticello as a gift from Mr. Ennis, who comments it's roughly executed, and I think it shows the maker to have had some talent. So to show you a little bit and give you a perspective about this idea that this site isn't fully vacant when we arrive as Anglo-British colonials at the end of the last decades of the 18th century, we had the Chickasaw that occupied the West Tennessee region, primarily south of the Duck River and west of the Tennessee. And at the early parts of the 18th century, the Shawnee were here in this Cumberland River region of Middle Tennessee, but they're pushed out by the Cherokee and Chickasaw working together largely by 1745. But the Shawnee had been here for centuries, and in an effort to trade with those, the French, who controlled this whole area in the early 18th century, had created a trading post here at Nashville, which they called the French Lick. So by 1714, you have Frenchmen here about where Nashville is trading with the Shawnee. But that largely disappears by mid-century through this conflict and alliance between the Cherokee and Chickasaw. The Yuchi there that are along the Tennessee Valley and Sequatchie Valley area, they leave by the 16th century. So this is a little earlier look at who natively occupied this. So by the final decades of the 18th century, when Virginians and North Carolinians and Pennsylvanians are sort of pushing into this area, at that stage, what they're met with is just hunting parties and temporary camps in this area, but still controlled by the Cherokee and Chickasaw. And this is a native Tennessean here. This is Kunashote, who factors into the legal basis upon which that first settlements will occur in Tennessee. So he is a signer of the Sycamore Shoals Treaty in 1775. The very first person to settle into Tennessee is said to be Mr. Bean and his family, who settled on a creek up in Upper East Tennessee about 1768. Now, you've had temporary excursions into Tennessee, primarily hunting game, but all these stories are going back east about the plentiful game, the wonderful valleys, all these waterways, and people are told at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, just don't go west. And as I said the other day, the best way to populate an area is to tell people not to go into it. And so that starts to occur by the 1760s. And by 1775, there are enough people thinking that they're in North Carolina who are soon surprised to learn that they're actually in, they think they're in Virginia, soon surprised to learn that they're in North Carolina, that they make a treaty with the Cherokee in 1775, which creates the largest private land purchase, totally illegal, but it's still the largest private land purchase in the Transylvania Purchase. And you'll see this lower part of the Transylvania land purchase includes this whole Cumberland River Valley above the Cumberland and includes what will become Nashville. So with that in mind, we have James Robertson coming from eastern Tennessee along a path through Kentucky in 1779 to meet here at the Salt Lick, or the French Lick, and at that same time in the spring, John Donaldson's party, coming the long route up and around the rivers to bring the women and a lot of the enslaved people that will start this in 1779-80. We're at Rock Castle on Wednesday, and I told you that Daniel Smith had begun his house about 1784. And so in 1779-80, while these very first settlers are coming in here, Daniel Smith is working to extend this line, this North Carolina-Virginia line, because this is Virginia, this is North Carolina during this time period. So Smith is extending this line, and that's why he finds that very nice spot around Drake's Creek as a surveyor, and that's where he'll put his house. So, whoops, hit the wrong side there. So let's talk briefly a little bit about the background of some of the furniture that we might see. So the treaty is signed with the Cherokee in March of 1775. If you'll remember your history, just a month later, the first shots of the Revolution are being fired at Lexington and Concord. So that's the proximate time period in which Tennessee is starting. We are part of the Revolution. You might not think that when you see all those battle sites out there, but we are participants. And a lot of the people who get here are, in fact, revolutionaries, both during and immediately following the Revolution. One of the people who signs, along with Kunishote, on that Transylvania Purchase and other purchases, private land purchases, is a fellow that we pick up in 1819, dying in Knoxville, Tennessee, who happens to be a cabinet maker, evident from his inventory. And that fellow is Moses Crawford. And once we trace back his history, we find him coming out of Augusta County, Virginia, and building this furniture that is, I think, inspired by some of the things that you see in Palladio Londinensis, published at the early part of the 19th century, early part of the 18th century, excuse me, but shows features common to the Delaware River Valley as they're interpreted through the mechanism of traveling down the Shenandoah Valley and ultimately expressed in this case in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this is part of a large group, and we'll see a desk and bookcase in the exhibit this afternoon that Crawford made. You also see other artifacts coming in and drifting in that may or may not have been manufactured here. This very early chair, which descended in the family, was always referred to as the Sevier chair. Sevier himself was from Augusta County, Virginia, and you see him in an early picture here. He's our first governor. He was also the governor of the lost state of Franklin. We had a little spat with North Carolina for a few years there in the late 1780s and kind of withdrew. The Articles of Confederation at the time were not strong enough to accept a 14th state into the Union, and we had to bide our time. Eventually Sevier makes amends with the North Carolinians and is pardoned, and he becomes our first governor. I'd like to tell you that James Peale, the artist, is actually painting Sevier there, but we know he's not. He's painting someone else. We will see to a small extent some line and berry inlay in early East Tennessee furniture, and I think that the reasoning behind that is because some of the very earliest persons who came, and you don't bring large things down miles and miles and miles of wagon roads, but you bring things that are personal to you and which mean a lot to yourself. And one of those items might be a little box like this, which comes down to the Register family in Greene County, Tennessee, and that becomes a template for later people to see and find expression in the early 19th century. An odd little twist of a piece here. This is in the Mesda collection, this chest of drawers here, where the cabinet maker is, I think Dan Ackerman has correctly pointed out, has basically used a design source which was trying to tell you could either go with this nice little scrolling here or you could go with a reading. And he says, why don't we just put the two things together on the thing? Let's see how we do that. And because he did that, and it's so distinctive, we can connect his work in Tennessee back to the work that he was participating in back in Virginia. Here we have a background map of the Southwest Territory, and you get an idea. Population is largely centered there in East Tennessee, but you see kind of what's going on in the middle there, and you see the comparative total slaves and total population. This is what we needed to get to statehood. Again, just a brief look at what we're choosing here. The pink there is the Nashville or Central Basin. That's where most of our early furniture is going to be originated. You see a 3D map here that kind of gives you an impression of that as well. And I tell people, someone asked me about secondary woods the other day, and I tell them that poplar is our predominant wood. It is. And as it turns out, I don't see many yellow pine trees out in the wild producing lumber for us. And if you look at a map here on one of the largest varieties here, you see the absence of it there in that map there. It's just not present. So Nashville was never a bywater. The earliest people bring great artifacts. In 1815, we have a cabinet maker by the name of James Hicks who is producing what's described in the New York Book of Prices as a pedestal in sideboard. This one, I think, having, with those reeded legs, some indication that he's familiar with Philadelphia furniture, but this is a very tasteful piece done in the native cherry wood, which is the predominant wood after 1800 here that we see. This young fellow became famous here in Tennessee and left for Texas, became famous in Texas, but his older brother, James, was a cabinet maker here in Nashville. Born in Rockbridge County, Virginia, you see none of the backcountry that you might think of inspired in what you see here, but you see, again, Philadelphia and Baltimore. You can see these particular pieces, the elliptic bureau and a couple of card tables there. You'll see at the Hermitage later in this week, I think, maybe today or tomorrow. We have an article of furniture that we actually named for our president. Jackson's the most famous person in America after the War of 1812, after the Battle of New Orleans. And by about 1825, we're starting to name this particular form for Jackson. This example is made by a cabinet maker over in Rutherford County. And they fixed the Hermitage. It doesn't look like this anymore. We're fortunate because the Ladies Hermitage Association took over the Hermitage property in the late 1880s, and they quickly began to try to acquire things that belonged to Jackson. And two of those articles tell us much about what was being built in the 1790s here in Nashville. This is a bureau and desk and bookcase by Joseph McBride, again working in what would be the Philadelphia style, but here attenuated as bookcases became there in Frederick County, Virginia, where we believe McBride was from before he arrived here in Nashville. I saw this desk years ago and took the picture so long ago on slides that I actually believed in memory that it was part of that McBride group, but then when I began to look a little bit more broadly, I discovered that it had a relationship to a desk coming out of Guilford County, North Carolina, again in the Delaware Valley style. We think of that coming down the valley, but sometimes it leaped over mountains coming from North Carolina. And this is the North Carolina desk at the top, and the McGavick family desk made here in Middle Tennessee by Robert Matthews, who came here about 1810 from Guilford County, North Carolina. And again, working in the Delaware Valley style, but not from the origin story that we would normally tell. We had the experience on Wednesday to come to Cragfont. You see it here in a little bit different state than its present restoration. And we talked about the cabinet makers and carpenters who came some 700 miles distant to work there and produce the furnishings. We talked briefly about these early Earl portraits. These are documented to 1817. And this is our reference to Connecticut, because you may or may not know that Ralph E. W. Earl, who's a lot of his work you'll see at the Hermitage again, was actually a native of Connecticut and the son of Ralph Earl, the famous Connecticut painter. I mentioned to you the card tables. Again, you see very much the popular form that would have been made at the same time in Baltimore, but here in cherry, not mahogany, with simple line inlay, and the documentation for William, the cabinet maker, being here in 1802, where he took an apprentice that year, a fellow by the name of Moses Marash, who he later turned in they said, which you didn't normally turn back in apprentices, but he did, he said because of a defect in his learning. He really wasn't that stupid. General Winchester winds up hiring him as a miller, so I think it was the fact that William was going back to Baltimore. We mentioned construction. Here again, the Pembroke from that group, the sideboard, very British in construction. You have these urban segmented glue blocks. You have full dust boards and a paneled back, which you see a little piece of there. The general's secretary and a china press that is owned privately. I get to look at this every day. This is kind of fun. And a looking glass that William Winchester actually made here. At Hawthorne Hill, I mentioned to you that Colonel Humphrey Bate was from Bertie County, North Carolina. He was actually orphaned as a young child and trained as a cabinet maker. So far as we know, he only practiced as a surveyor here in Middle Tennessee. But you have here cellarette found just over the line in Kentucky, which I like to claim sure looks like work from Bertie County, and I think if he did make any furniture here, that's what he would have produced. And here, it's a cellarette form, but look what they've done. We've got plenty of liquor here, but we're going to use it in a sugar chest form if you see the divisions there. Ironically, as high style as that Baltimore-inspired furniture is, just down the road we've got John Gillespie working as a Scots-Irish trained cabinet maker coming out of the Piedmont of North Carolina, and he's producing furniture that looks like that. We have a group of what appear to be walnut cellarettes, but were probably used as sugar chests once they were manufactured here in Tennessee, the Tennessee version on the right. On the left, an example in the Colonial Williamsburg collection of which they attribute to Joseph Freeman, who himself was born there and worked in Gates County, North Carolina, and produces a consistent large group of furniture with this sorting slide and divided on the interior for bottle cases. The Discovery, we have 4 of those in Middle Tennessee, none of which have a sorting slide. They all have empty interiors that we believe were for sugar chest use. And the 3 of them have no real connection or provenance. One does, and it connects up to Wessington Plantation, and I think there's a germ of figuring this out in that discovery because, in fact, Joseph Washington comes from Southampton County, Virginia, which is just immediately north of Gates County where all this is going on back in North Carolina. And Wessington is the home of not barns on fire, but what you might see is barns smoking if you get here at the end of the summer when they're harvesting dark-fired tobacco, which is actually cured through a process kind of like meats in a smokehouse. So the unknowing might travel through in the course of a day or so and wind up thinking a barn's on fire. So there you have, again, our local version of that. Very quickly, our last little thing to look at here, you'll see this desk at the State Museum later today. It was made for a fellow named Samuel McAdoo. You see his initials engraved there on the fall lid. And this was a new discovery back in 1988, and we used it for the back cover of our book. It was attributed to a fellow named James B. Quarles, we know as a cabinet maker, because he was killed while fighting with Andrew Jackson in 1814, and we have an in-state inventory. For many years, we didn't know if he built bookcases, and then this shows up, which is apparently a little bit earlier version from his shop of either James or John Quarles, his father. Following that auction, I had the chance to examine this piece closely, and on the back of one of the drawers, we see the names James, John, and the date 1804. So this dates to very early in the period, and it's collaborative between father and son. And I felt good about our attribution from 30 years ago, which is largely made just on these cues that appear inside the case. But we'd also had some other indications that they were the appropriate people. So this particular one has the initials NG. They were very good about putting owners' names on things. Turns out NG is not a very common combination of consonants, and so we really only had 3 candidates, and I ultimately landed on Mr. Gum there. And in fact, although this piece is made here in Wilson County, it's made near Fall Creek, and Jefferson was then the county seat for Rutherford, which had just come away from and be created out of Wilson County in 1803. So there's a close combination of why we might think of this piece being just over the line into Rutherford County. So I began to explore who Mr. Gum was. Turns out he marries a Clampett back in East Tennessee in 1793. And I think she's right. Fellows can be more fun than critters. And in tracing the history of Mr. Gum, we know very little about him other than he was prominent there in Jefferson County, the type of person that you might expect would, in fact, create a desk and bookcase or need this. And tracing his genealogy, we get to his great-great-grandson, Francis Avent Gum, the last to live here in Middle Tennessee. And Francis was the father of these vaudevillian girls, Mary Jane, Virginia, and Frances Ethel. And you probably know Frances Ethel, even if you don't remember who she is, and you might be as astonished as she appears to be to learn of this connection. Thank you very much.